Professor Kanti Bajpai and dear participants, good afternoon and welcome to a very special webinar on the future of India-China relations. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. To talk on a very interesting topic of today, we have very distinguished scholar, Professor Kanti Prasad Bajpai from Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. Professor Dr. Kanti Bajpai is Wilmar Professor of Asian Studies, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy since 2014, and Director at Center on Asia and Globalisation at Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at National University of Singapore. Before coming to Lee Kuan Yew School, he was Professor of International Politics at Jawaharlal Nehru University and Professor in the Politics and International Relations of South Asia at Oxford University. From 2003 to 2009, he was associated with the Doon School, India. He also taught at the Maharajah Sayajirao University of Baroda, and he has held visiting appointment at Wesleyan University and the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. In addition to this, he has held a visiting appointment at Rajiv Gandhi Foundation, Joan B. Kroc Institute of Peace, Notre Dame University, the Brookings Institutions, and the Asian Defence Force Academy. He was Distinguished Fellow at the Institute of Defence Studies and Analyses, New Delhi. He is an international affairs analyst and a well-known expert on India-China relations. Professor Bajpai's areas of interest include international security, India's foreign policy, and national security. Professor Bajpai has authored, co-authored, edited several books, chapters, reports, and articles. Some of his works are India, the West, and International Order, published in 2019, India and the World, Trials of the Republic in 2017, India versus China, published in 2021, and many more. Professor Bajpai, once again, welcome to our program. Kindly make your remarks in around 20 to 30 minutes, which will be followed by question and answers. The program is streaming live on Facebook and several other platforms. We'd like to request our participants to drop their questions on Zoom chat or on the Facebook Live. Please share the live videos on social media, Twitter, Facebook, and other platforms. We'd also like our audience to tweet or WhatsApp their questions if they want. Professor Bajpai, over to you. Thank you, sir.
Pramod, thank you very much. And let me just begin by thanking NICE for this very gracious invitation and an opportunity to address a Nepalese, but also an international audience here. So it's very nice to be here. I've spoken about my book in various forums, especially last year, but not very recently. So I'm a bit refreshed now. And it's terrific to do a session with a fellow regional institution in South Asia, and particularly Nepal. I was a little boy in Nepal. My father was a diplomat there in the 1950s. So I have a feeling of particular kinship there. So once again, great to be here, and very earnest thanks again to NICE and to Pramod. Very good to see some colleagues, especially my colleague from JNU, Anuradha Chinoy, who's also on. As I said to Pramod when he invited me, I'm going to speak off the book that I published recently, which is called India versus China, Why They Are Not Friends. The title comes really much more from my publisher, I think. I'm not sure I wanted it to be such a blunt title, but when you're dealing with publishers, you've got to take into account their marketing needs. And they just thought that it would attract the eye, given that there's always publishing on China-India relations fairly regularly. And so you have to find you have to hit the eyeballs, as it were, a little bit. The book was written very quickly, and just to situate it a little bit and where I'm coming from. In the fall of 2020, it was written for a general audience, but it was researched, mostly secondary sources. So it draws on the writings and insights of others. And of course, I provide a framework which was my own. The book was written, as I said, for a general audience. But I think it's had a bit more of a readership than that, and I hope so in any case. It was written in the shadow of the rather sad events in Galman in June, July 2020. Although thinking about the book had begun before that episode, so it was influenced by, but it was not. It's not really a treatment of that and very recent breaking news kinds of events. It tried to answer the question, which is in the subtitle, why they are not friends. In a sense, that plays off the larger context soon after 1947, when India became independent, and 1949, when Mao and his associates, the Communist Party, took charge of China, when there was a feeling that India and China would be friends, that historically, even in recent contemporary history leading up to the events of 47, 49, that they could very much be friends. And that right through at least the mid-1950s, you'll recall there was the old Hindi Chini bhai bhai kind of feeling, whether altogether warranted or not, but it was an animating sort of trope that seemed to be around, and something of an expectation echoed on both sides by the leaderships that they could indeed be friends. So the slight excuse for the bluntness of the title is that it tried to pick up a little bit on and pose as a counterpoint to the original feeling of kind of mutual convergence and friendship and partnership that then fell apart by the late 1950s and, of course, peaked, I suppose, in the War of 1962. So with that brief introduction, I just want to say how the book was organized and talk about the four major parts of the book, and then end with some thoughts, just very brief, on the future, because I think the four elements of the book that I talk about give us some pointers towards the future, but I may leave discussion on the future a bit more to the Q&A, if you don't mind, because otherwise I think I won't get enough time to do Q&A, and I think it's far more interesting and productive to work interactively. So here goes on the four main parts of the book. The book is organized around 4 Ps. So in answer to the question why they are not friends, I say they are not friends because of the 4 Ps. That is perceptions, perimeters. Perimeters is just a fancy word for differences over the border and over Tibet. Thirdly, partnerships. That is partnerships with 2 other great powers, the Soviet Union, later Russia, and the United States. So there was a quadrant of powers that has interacted pretty regularly. That is China, India, the Soviet Union, Russia, and the United States. And that third element of the book looks at how India and China partnered or didn't partner with these other 2 powers. And the last chapter, perhaps in some ways the most significant and perhaps the best known or best understood and appreciated out there, is power. The asymmetry of power increasingly between the 2 powers, between China and India. The subtitles of these chapters kind of give you a flavor of the thesis in each chapter. So the chapter on perceptions, which is really about the kind of historical and contemporary images that they hold of each other, which I think are very important. Perceptions are very important in kind of framing how we look at each other, including as nations. And the subtitle of that is From Respect to Disdain, which describes a movement of historically the 2 societies having looked up to each other in various ways, culturally and otherwise, to a time, especially in the 20th century, and up to this point where they increasingly look at each other not so respectfully, more disdainfully. And I think that's one of the kind of almost foundational problems between the two societies. The second P is perimeters, and this chapter in the book looks at the border problem in Tibet. And Tibet and the border problem are so intimately linked because obviously Tibet is the province or the autonomous region, whatever you want to call it, that abuts India, and that's where the border is defined. So you can't really separate those 2 problems out very much. And that chapter is subtitled From Cooperation to Conflict in 2 cycles, and I'll come to that in a bit. But the point that it makes fundamentally is that contrary to the very negative view that the two never cooperated successfully or tried very hard to cooperate over the borderlands. In fact, they did, and they did so repeatedly, despite the war, despite periodic breakdowns. But of course, they haven't resolved the problem, particularly of the border, as we know. But it tries to establish the point that they did try. And my own sense is that at various times in good faith. So the kind of conspiracy theory view that each was out to trick the other and never negotiated in good faith, I take that to be not the case. And the third chapter is called is partnerships, and the subtitle there is From Entente to Conflict to Cold War, or Cold War to conflict. And it makes the point broadly, again, in two cycles, during the Cold War and in the post-Cold War period, that India and China have never been on the same side. When they partnered, Soviet Union or Russia or the United States, China and India were always on opposite sides. So sometimes India was with the Soviets, and then the Chinese were with the Americans. Sometimes India was with the United States, and the Chinese were with the Soviets or with Russia, and that continues to this day. The only two powers in this quadrant of four powers that have never been strategic partners against either the Soviet Union, Russia, or the United States are China and India. All the others have partnered each other, but India and China have never partnered each other. And I think that's quite significant as well. And the last is subtitled, this is the chapter on power, and it's subtitled From Symmetry to Asymmetry, or From Equality to Inequality. And it really describes the progression of a growing power gap from about, well, even as late as the 1980s, perhaps the early 1980s, when you could talk about India and China being roughly in the same category in terms of comprehensive national power, to a period now when we know China's GDP, for instance, in nominal terms is 5 times India's. And the gap in absolute terms is actually growing, it's not reducing, and it will grow further. And that's a very big problem for the two sides. And I'll say why for both sides, although it would seem that that's a problem only for India, but I think it's actually, in a sense, a problem for both. Okay, so let me say a little bit about these 4 Ps and then use them to structure some comments towards the end about the future. So I think if you go with the first one, which is perceptions, images, worldviews in which they situate each other, I mean, I would say that very broadly, if you go back to ancient times, given Buddhism, the Buddhist links between the two, one can say, I think, that very crudely, that China looked up to India culturally, let's say spiritually, if you like, until about the year 1000 AD. It's just a very crude marker, actually maybe not even 1000 AD, because Buddhism was in recession in India even before that. And by the way, I mean, it's worth saying, of course, that when we use the word China and India in ancient times, we're not talking about the modern kind of landmass and society of China and India, but these are just conveniences for modern times. So I think that's the first point that the chapter makes, which is that China kind of looked up to India. Pilgrims, traders, monks, others who sought out Buddhist instruction and inspiration did come to India. And of course, there was some traffic from India to China as well. China, of course, took on Buddhism, made it its own, exported it to other parts of the world. And so that has to be recognized as well. But I think it's fair to say that after about 1000 AD, that traffic between the two went into steep decline. And by about the 15th century, to some extent, roles were reversed. There were kingdoms in India that now looked up to China, to the imperial China, and sent tribute to the Chinese court. We know that parts of Kerala, some kingdoms in what is today Bengal area, perhaps even from Tamil Nadu. And of course, there was, I mean, it's peaked in a sense by the expeditions of Admiral Cheng He, who touched down in parts of peninsular India, of course went to Sri Lanka, and there's that famous episode, of course, of his taking a Sri Lankan king back to China and so on, and all of that. But I would say at that point, you could say that India looked up to China, or parts of India looked up to China politically, perhaps even to some extent economically, culturally, in terms of these tributes. Thereafter, the two societies increasingly are alienated from each other as China closed off its, as it were, its international engagement across the seas. The two lost touch, although the Indians and Chinese met in third places, Southeast Asia and so on. And then the links are reestablished under European imperialism. In India, colonization; in China, increasing imperial enclaves and incursions, although never full-scale colonization. And I point in the book to what Shyam Saran and others now, I think in Shyam Saran's recent book, you'll see a fuller development of this. But by the late 19th century, Chinese intellectuals looking at India were asking the question, how did this great civilization to the west of China fall under the sway for such a long time of imperialism? And they concluded, via their reading of India through colonial sources, Japanese sources, which in turn were based on colonial sources, that India was a defeated society, that it was a dysfunctional society ridden by caste, by economic inequality, by religious differences, and it was therefore a kind of chaotic, disorganized, even cowardly society that was unable to put up any resistance. And the lesson these 19th century intellectuals placed before China, as it seemed to be succumbing to imperial control, was never be like India. So, to underline the point about this kind of growing disdain between the two, you can see by the late 19th century that China beginning to look at India with a rather, unhappy eye, rather contemptuous eye. India, of course, has its own record of looking at China through colonial eyes, and the colonial disdain for Chinese practices, Chinese society, and so on. They're all opium addicts and so on and so forth. China itself regarded as a weak country and feudalistic and so on and so forth. That was equally, in a sense, communicated to Indians who were looking at China. And I think just to run the story very fast forward, I mean, you just have to look at social media and other kinds of instances of how the two societies look at each other. And you'll see that there are very, very negative views. Now, of course, social media attracts, as it were, the most extreme views, sometimes the least informed, most kind of negative and pejorative views of peoples and processes. But they're full of racism on both sides, full of a kind of opprobrium and bad feeling and criticism. And so I think broadly, that's what the chapter shows, is that, these two societies historically that had periods of looking up to each other have fallen into a period through colonialism and then subsequently of kind of contempt and disdain to each. Perhaps to some extent, the guns of both have played their own role in furthering those images of each other. So I think that's the first big reason why they can't be friends, or they are not friends. The second, of course, is the issue of the borderlands. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So we can.
Yeah, because it's signaling me that the internet connection may not be very stable. The second is, of course, the borderlands. I think this part of the relationship is so written about and perhaps so well understood to a lot of people that I won't dwell on it for very long, otherwise we'll be here the whole day and we don't have that kind of time. But what the chapter tries to show in the book is that, contrary to the general view, beginning from about the early 1950s, India and China did sit down to try and negotiate in good faith a resolution of the border problem. Nehru on the Indian side and Zhou Enlai, primarily the interlocutor on the Chinese side. And what you can see is that until the late 1950s, both sides had an interesting policy debate, as it were, showing a kind of division. One school of thought on the Indian side was the sooner India engaged China on the border issue, the better. China was, as it were, coming online under the communists. It was relatively weak. This was the time for India to engage it and to get as good a deal as possible, and to lay the basis for cooperation and a more enduring, stable relationship. This was championed by, say, for instance, Girja Bajpai, KPS Menon. But there was another school of thought, primarily led by the Indian ambassador in Beijing at the time, K.M. Panikkar, the historian and public intellectual and, of course, diplomat, who felt that it would be better for India to leave China to raise the border issue, not to engage it until China did, and for India to concentrate more on establishing its presence in the northern borderlands, getting real control over the areas it had inherited from the British. So there was a sooner school and a later school in terms of when to negotiate with China and India. And Nehru seemed to oscillate between the two, but eventually came down on the side of Panikkar. And so he didn't bite the bullet on really raising the issue very quickly with the Chinese. On the Chinese side, interestingly, there was exactly the same counterpart points of view. The Sooner School was a group of cartographers, primarily from Tibet, who, looking at the record, felt that China had a very strong case in all the sectors of the borderland and should engage India immediately. And then there was Zhou Enlai and Mao, who were dealing with all kinds of other issues, consolidation of Chinese Communist Party rule internally, the Korean War, the emerging Cold War, all kinds of other things. And they weren't quite sure that the case was ready to be made to India, and they wanted to hold off. There were other reasons we can deal with in the Q&A, but in effect, both sides, with Zhou Enlai and Mao really overruling the Sooner School, decided not to engage the matter head on. And I think a real opportunity was lost when there were towering political figures who might have much before, particularly on the Indian side, public opinion got in the way, have made some real concessions and negotiated a settlement. Anyway, we know that from that, things went wrong. Both began to doubt what seemed to be postponement of the issue, and some ambivalent statements on both sides, or ambiguous statements on both sides about what they were willing to concede and how they conceived of the border. That translated, as the years went on, into suspicion that the other side was not being transparent, was negotiating in bad faith, and trust was lost. So what might have been, in a sense, disorganization on both sides was seen by the other side as dishonesty. And I'll come back to this issue of disorganization, maybe in the Q&A if people are interested. Likewise, on Tibet, you'll recall that there was an Indian agreement with China on Tibet in 1950, and then again, most famously in 1954, where India essentially pulled out its interests and its kind of involvement in Tibet as per an agreement with China that China would respect cultural, the cultural autonomy of Tibet and religious autonomy of Tibet. And that was the cooperative good beginning. But by 1955-56, when the rebellion, the Khampa rebellion broke out and then spread, there was a Chinese view that India was not being honest, that it was actually trying to, instigate more rebellion, that India had teamed up with the CIA to get involved in Tibetan affairs. And likewise, on Delhi's side, there was a view that China was not keeping to the 1954 agreement to honor a certain degree of commitment to, Tibetan autonomy. So again, from cooperation, they went into conflict over Tibet. And I think if you combine the two, then 1962, the War of 62 looks far more comprehensible. In both cases, they went from cooperation to conflict and increasingly distrust of each other. I said in two cycles of cooperation and conflict because almost immediately after the 62 war, both India and China started to move back towards engaging each other and on the border issue, culminating in the beginnings of formal border negotiations in 1981. mean, it took 19 years to get there after the 62 war, but they were, attempts that got derailed here and there before that. But from 1981 to today, there's been almost unbroken bilateral negotiations on the border in various ways. And 2005, the guidelines and parameters on the settlement of the border was probably the culmination of the climaxing of the cooperative effort. But again, from almost immediately after the 2005 agreement between the two sides on what might have been the basis for a border settlement, conflict began to emerge over the borderlands. China had some doubts about the 2005 agreement. India became distrustful when China expressed some doubts about that agreement. And you had the emergence once again of differences, incursions increasing on the border. And then from 2013, 2014, 2015, 2017, and then 2020, you have a series of militarized confrontations on the border. Likewise, on Tibet, by about 2006, perhaps slightly later, differences over Tibet begin to emerge also. And by 2010, India stops in its bilateral joint statements with China. It stops making the usual standard statement that it regards Tibet as a part of China and so on and so forth. This is in response to what it saw as various Chinese statements and behaviors over Arunachal Pradesh in particular. So when Indian leaders would go to Arunachal Pradesh to campaign or whatever, China would issue statements saying, Arunachal Pradesh belongs to us and how dare your prime minister go there. So there was, who started it is a bit hard to sort out, but both again got locked into a pattern of differences over Tibet. Okay, so twice we have cycles of attempted cooperation, some successes, and then a breakdown into conflict over the borderlands. Thirdly, there's the issue of partnerships. Here I'll be much quicker, but in the Cold War period, one can say that India and China were in a kind of entente from about 1949 to 1954-55, where they both looked at the United States with some worry and concern as a hegemon for their own different reasons. They weren't partners, but their views converged on the idea that the United States and the former colonial powers in Asia were a bit of a menace, and Asia should be for Asians free of great power, especially Western Western presence. But this broke down fairly quickly by the late 1950s. China fell out with the Soviet Union. The Soviets were also fairly close to India and China at this point in opposition to the US. There was a famous Sino-Soviet split by the late 1950s. India stayed somewhat in the middle, but as relations with China worsened, Delhi began to incline ever more towards the Western side. And of course, we know that from 1962 to 63, from the war with China to about a year or two later, India almost became a kind of quasi-ally of the West, when American arms and American intelligence and so on flowed to India from the war onwards for about a year or two. So what you see here is that, from a period of entente between India and China on great power relations, they split. India siding with the United States for a brief while, and China, of course, being on the other side. And then, of course, by 1971, after Kissinger's and Nixon's famous opening to China, a complete switch around occurs. India gets close to the Soviet Union and partners it, the Chinese partner, the United States. So here again, and this holds till the end of the Cold War. And what this means essentially is that throughout the Cold War, they're never partners. Their leaderships were never in partnership against another great power, a common enemy, a common rival. This is important because at the grand strategy level, here are two leaderships where their military, the military high commands, their strategists, their political leaderships, their senior civil service leadership, their foreign officers and so on, never thoroughly integrated. Whereas India has a record of that kind of partnership with the West through colonialism, with the Soviets through much of the Cold War. It never had it with China. China had it with the Americans during the latter half of the Cold War and with the Soviets before that, but it never had that with India. So a fundamental sort of, and one should know that India and China were never partners against any society over history, except India and China, as it were, from 1937 to the end of the Second World War, when Chiang Kai-shek, of course, was a part of the Western alliance against the Japanese, and supplies and so on went from India to China. And of course, the Congress Party and Chiang Kai-shek had a bit of a relationship. After the Cold War, one goes through another cycle of India-China entente, kind of tacit understanding that America now as the hegemon, without even a Soviet Union to check it, was a danger to them. And that partnership again, not that partnership, but that kind of convergence between India and China erodes. And by the early 2000s, India is getting closer to the United States in the shadow of rising Chinese power. The Americans are encouraging that. And the Chinese are drifting closer to Russia to counter the United States. And I think that's where we are now, in essence. Again, India now is closer to the United States. China to Russia, they're on opposite sides of strategic partnerships. And I think this is important because it underlines the fact that they have never been together and never quite trusted each other at the highest levels in terms of joint planning or a very thorough kind of sense of knowledge of each other's highest level leadership. And I think that kind of human capital that builds up between strategists and political leaderships never occurred between India and China and remains to this day. Finally, and I'll just end up here in 5 minutes, power. Of course, international relations and relationships between countries we know is underwritten by, or if that's too strong a word, is regulated by, affected by the power relationship between them. And in the modern period, I think it's very fair to say after 1947, 49, that the two were more or less equal in various terms, various measures, until about 1980 or so. In fact, on some measures, India might have done slightly better than China, economically at least, until about then. But from about 1980, the gap starts to grow. Attendant on Deng Xiaoping's reforms, and that's a story that's now very well known, so I won't repeat it, but you can just look at the World Bank figures and so on, and the paths just continue to diverge. And today, as I said, China's GDP is about 5 times India's. China's GDP in nominal terms is about 14.6 trillion. India's is about 2.6 or a bit more. That's a $12 trillion gap. That is enormous in absolute terms. And I think often we tend to forget when we focus on growth rates and we say, oh, India has been matching China's growth rates over the last 7 or 8 years. Yes, but 7% on 2.5 trillion still means that the absolute gap is growing when China is going at 6 or 7% on 14 trillion. If that kind of pattern goes on, this 12 trillion gap in nominal terms could become almost twice that in the next 15 to 20 years. So even if China slows down and India accelerates somewhat, this gap of 12 trillion could amount to $20 trillion gap. That is an enormous gap in economic capability. Now, of course, it's very difficult to extrapolate over these kinds of periods of time, but I just want to put that out there as a bit of a provocation, but to give you a sense of how big the gap is now beginning to be between these two. On the military realm, though, so there's economic power, but there's military power. Thanks to geography and certain kinds of strategy that follow from it, in fact, even though China has a lead in most major weapon systems, and even in terms of overall maybe numbers of people under arms, although it depends on how you count, in fact, India is relatively comfortable for now. So India is saved geographically by the Himalayas in the north, along the borderlands, and in the maritime domain, even though China has a formidable navy now, it's saved geographically by geography because the distances from Chinese bases in Hainan and so on into the Bay of Bengal and the Indian Ocean are still very long. Chinese bases, there are only one or two of them outside of China, or Djibouti, for instance, perhaps some calling rights in Gwadar, who knows. But those bases are extremely vulnerable to Indian power, Indian naval power, Indian air power. So actually, they're a liability for China. They're not an asset, it would seem to me. And the Chinese Navy coming into the maritime domain, Indian air power and naval units could still intercept and harass the Chinese. So on the borderlands in the Himalayas, when you're fighting at 16,000 feet, 13,000 feet at those extreme temperatures, I don't think either side can make any great, military kind of incursions. And so India has an ability in that asymmetric situation to hold its own, provided it doesn't make any mistakes and holds its nerve. So it would seem to me, oddly enough, that in the military domain, which a lot of people focus on, India is actually comfortable for the next little while, although Chinese technological developments are threatening to perhaps turn the tables both in the Himalayas, but particularly in the maritime domain. The last part of that power chapter is focused on soft power, which you'll recall is the idea that a country can get its way vis-a-vis a rival by the power of persuasion, the power of attraction. So you don't need to put a gun to someone's head and coerce it. Your culture, the attractions to your politics, what you stand for globally, your image and status might cause others to do what you want them to do without you having to ever pull the trigger, as it were. And here, where it's difficult to estimate soft power and compare, but there are some indicators out there, and the book follows some indicators that, that the Australian Lowy Institute has produced, and they do this every year or two, which shows grosso modo that China leads even on significant elements of soft power. And let me leave it there. That's a bit of a provocative view, because I think the general view is that the opposite is the case. That India, because of its relative openness, its noisy democracy, its popular culture, its knowledge of English and so on, might actually have the soft power lead globally. But my own reading is looking at these sources, and some impressionistic kind of conclusions, to be sure, is that that's not the case either. So I think we can say that on power, there is an asymmetry. It's growing, particularly in the economic domains. Now, what's the import of that? The import of that is the following, which is very important, and I'll just stop here. China, given its enormous lead, increasingly does not see why it should make any kinds of concessions to India. If it is in pole position in terms of power, its view is that there's no need to indulge India. And on the Indian side, given the enormous power gap, any even reasonable concession would seem to be difficult, because any concession would be read as being the slippery slope to fundamental kind of appeasement of China, of surrender, strategic surrender. And the Indian public might not accept that, and India's standing globally and India's own sort of identity as a civilization that's comparable to China and so on. I think there's a complex set of things there that simply won't allow India to look at itself making any kind of, very significant concessions to China either. So this power asymmetry, you see, has locked the two into almost a stalemate, where neither side, the Chinese don't have the incentive to make concessions, and the Indians don't have, in a sense, the political courage to make the concessions. And that means that they're very fundamentally stuck until this power gap, it would seem logically, is reduced such that China feels it has an interest to make concessions so as to bring India on board and not alienate India too much. And India has the confidence to make certain concessions without looking like it's surrendering. So let me stop there. I think these are four rather strong, almost structural reasons why they're not friends. It's not a grand theory of India-China relations. It's not that kind of book. But it seems to me these four are connected. The book didn't have enough space for me to try and connect them. I think that would be a very challenging task, although I could try it a bit in the Q&A if you're interested. But let me just stop there. I said I would say something about the future of India-China, but maybe I'll leave that to Q&A, so I stop talking at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Professor Bajpai, thank you so much for the comprehensive and enlightening presentation and remarks. You have touched upon wide-ranging issues, and we have also received lots of questions. So without taking much time, let me say those. I mean, we have received lots of questions on Indo-Pacific. How is Indo-Pacific strategy and Quad going to impact India-China relations? Or do you think that we may see a military clash between India and China in the Indian Ocean? And several other questions are on these peripheries. So your comment on this, sir.
Yeah, so the book doesn't address it, of course, but I think to be fair, that's an issue now, of course, that's very important. And I think, my broad sense is that if you look at, let's say, Indian policy on it, for instance, because I know that better, India has certainly come out looking rather ambivalent on the Indo-Pacific and the Quad. And this may reflect some of what I've been talking about, particularly the power asymmetry, and which is that, India doesn't want to risk alienating China beyond a point. It doesn't want to provoke China beyond a point, given the power asymmetry. It realizes that, both in terms of some of the kind of, the economic disparity, the military disparities here and there, the diplomatic disparity between India and China, that it would not be wise to provoke China by being part of what might begin to look like a kind of, Asian NATO. So India has, during Obama's time, Obama and Modi signed on to a kind of vision statement for the Indo-Pacific, which said, there ought to be freedom of navigation and so on and so forth, rules-based international order in the Indo-Pacific, affirmed the term the Indo-Pacific. But really after that high point, I would say that India has stepped back. I'll give you a few examples. When Narendra Modi spoke at the Shangri-La Dialogue here in 2018, the first Indian Prime Minister, a very senior official to speak at Shangri-La here in Singapore, the speech was notable for both a kind of affirmation of the free and open Indo-Pacific, but also very clearly and very noticeably, Modi's underlining that the free and open Indo-Pacific was not aimed at anyone, quote unquote. What did that mean? And that was a clear olive branch to China. And he even said it's an inclusive initiative. What was that? That was an olive branch to China. So I think that since then, until Galwan 2020, India certainly downplayed the Indo-Pacific and the Quad, saying semi-publicly that, no, it was not a military alliance, it was not directed against anyone, and all of that. And indeed, it kind of persuaded its other three partners to start adopting that language as well in the various confabulations. And it's not till Galwan that India kicks up the level of summitry and meetings in the Quad and the Indo-Pacific. Now they're at the level of foreign ministers, defense ministers, and even heads of state or prime ministers, but India came there quite reluctantly. And I think that, to run the story right up to Ukraine, I would say that India is still displaying a degree of ambivalence. It does not want to commit very solidly, very openly to a very military view of either. And it's particularly kind of averse, I think, to things like joint patrols, for instance. It certainly wouldn't do that. It's willing to do a certain amount of military exercises, but it prefers to do trilateral military exercises, India, Japan, USA, or quadrilaterals, India, Japan, Australia, USA in the Malabar, but not really under the aegis of the Quad and the Indo-Pacific. For the Chinese, on the Chinese side, though they've criticized the Indo-Pacific and the Quad and so on, but if you read Chinese scholars and experts, they've kind of said, China oughtn't to overdo the criticism. There are many divisions within the free and open Indo-Pacific venture and the Quad between the four partners, and China, by trying to criticize it too much, would only bring them together. So I think what's happened is, just to finish the thought, is that India has been a bit ambivalent to soft on the Indo-Pacific, to be frank, and the Chinese have held off from criticizing it beyond the point. To my mind, it's almost become, I wouldn't say it's a non-issue between them, but it never got to a kind of a point where it really divides them either. And I think both sides have a tacit now understanding that neither will push the Indo-Pacific kind of issue beyond a point when they engage each other. India will not exaggerate its attachment, and the Chinese won't exaggerate their criticism. And it's quite noticeable that sometimes when the Chinese do criticize the Indo-Pacific and the Quad, they kind of somehow leave India out of that criticism. It's directed more at Japan, Australia, and the United States.
Thank you, sir. There's a question that you said that China had ties with US and India had with the Soviet, but at present it seems both have exchanged their partners. In this context, how is this new engagement of India, US, and China, Russia going to impact India-China ties? That is one. Another is, can India afford to align with the US to the exclusion of China, keeping in mind the substantial trade that occurs between India and China in the post-pandemic Asian dynamics of shifting focus away from expansionist China?
Yeah, well, on the first part, I mean, I think it is clear that India tilts towards the United States now, and China clearly has quite a strong partnership, more than a tilt, towards Russia. But I mean, again, just to look at what's happening right now, you've seen that India has been neutralist on Ukraine. And so to that extent, and has been criticized by the United States and the Europeans, although in the last couple of weeks, we've seen a greater understanding of India's position from the Western countries. The Chinese, interestingly, also, I mean, they continue to make statements supportive of Moscow, but on the other hand, they have deliberately leaked from their own decision-making the notion that, they're not really prepared to sell arms to the Russians or to, facilitate certain kinds of financial transactions with the Russians because they don't want to provoke the West. So, the Chinese have, to some extent, been soft on the Ukraine issue, at least softer than people might have expected, and are trying to not quite adopt a middle ground like India, of course, but not committing outright to the Russian position. And I think the Chinese, looking at what Moscow has done, taken aback by probably the kind of almost incompetence of the Russian military. I think they're probably still scratching their heads over why this time Putin decided to do this, and whether he's made a terrible mistake if one sees perhaps the pulling together of NATO and the Western alliance suddenly, which the Chinese were trying to, split, and being fairly successful to some extent of trying to split Western countries over things like the BRI and so on. So I think the Chinese are a bit dismayed. India and China, to some extent, without coordinating with each other, they both moved to a sort of a middle ground on the issue, not quite a middle ground, but they're not that far apart. And I don't think they did it out of regard for each other, but what it does mean is that India and China are a bit distant from their two partners, India from the United States on this issue, China from Russia. When Wang Yi came to Delhi recently, it might have seemed that they could build on that, and I don't think that quite happened. Although it looks like Modi will attend the BRICS conclave, which I think Wang Yi was trying to make sure that he did. So I think there's some space there for, at a very big grand strategic level of this quadrant of powers again, that India and China somewhere understanding of each other's position. And just note one thing, February the 4th, statement by Putin and Xi Jinping. If you look at that statement, and it's sort of a broad take on international order, its criticism of sort of the Western-led order, the inequality in governing institutions of the global order, the kind of skepticism it shows towards democracy promotion and so on and so forth. And basically saying, we want a more multipolarized, egalitarian order, which is not led by the West. I don't think India would be unhappy with any part of that statement, except one, which was the criticism of the Quad and the Indo-Pacific. So, there's a basis for saying that in terms of the disposition towards the criticism of the current international order, India is fairly close to both Russia on one side and China on the other. That's something China could have built on. And, I think maybe have come closer to India on and used it to get closer on the bilateral. But it hasn't quite done it. And I think Beijing has missed an opportunity with Delhi there. But on the economic issue, I mean, of course, there's been, we've seen the recent trade figures between India and China, and they've never been higher. But I mean, again, investments between the two countries are being scrutinized in Delhi very closely. Certain areas are off limits for Chinese investment. The Chinese apps that were taken off the register as were in India, not available to Indian consumers, are still not available. So India is still sending a message. The foreign minister, Jaishankar, has said that until the border issue finds, some, that is the Galwan problem and what's happened in Ladakh, until there's some movement on that, India cannot resume full-blown economic relations with China. So I think, it's not going to be the old, economic story altogether. And of course, India still stays away from the BRI and connectivity projects with China. So there's still a fundamental divide. And, this trend was on before Galwan, from the incursions of 2013, 14, 15 in Birdsey, then Doklam 2017, there was a growing argument in India that from 1988 onwards, India had agreed to China's argument that full normalization and a wide array of engagements between the two would lay the basis for a fundamental resolution of the quarrel, especially the border problem. By about 2014, 15, you can see that in India, there's an erosion of that view, that normalization would lead to a solution of the border problem. I think India, after about 2014, 15, was coming around to the old view after 1962, which is that until the border, there was progress on the border, there couldn't be full normalization. And Galwan, I think, has underlined that. That's what Jaishankar is saying now. Until we get some, understanding on the border, maybe not a full settlement, but a resumption of the status quo ante before 2020 and a resumption of really solid dialogue, we're not going to go back to business as usual, prior to Galwan. And so in a sense, we're back to the understanding of India between 1962 and about 1981 under the Mrs. Gandhi period. And I don't think, the economic engagement is going to overturn that, no matter what Beijing wants, I think.
Professor Bajpai, you just mentioned that China and India have never been on the same side during the Cold War and have always supported the opposite faction. Can the current Russia-Ukraine conflict be the reason for both to support the same side, that is Russia, and start on a positive note?
No, I mean, I don't think so. I don't think, I was saying earlier that China and India, in a sense, have been in some sort of middle ground. Obviously, China more inclined towards Russia, India still, kind of being somewhat critical of Russia, at least elliptically, in its statements, but not wishing to alienate the West beyond the point on this issue. I mean, I can't see India wholesale teaming up with China and Russia on Ukraine, because India's got too much at stake with the Western countries. It needs the West to some, quite a large extent. It feels as a bolster against China, given the power disparity. At the end of the day, India, whatever its internal balancing may be, its development of its own weapon systems, its own economic progress. I mean, that's still many years away to try and bridge the gap with China. In the meantime, India will need what international relations scholars call external balancing, which is just a fancy term for partnerships or quasi-alliances or alliances. And so India needs the West as a kind of, bolstering against China, diplomatically, economically, even militarily, if it comes to it. I think we have to understand what India is doing here. It has positioned itself, this kind of ambivalence of India still between big powers is an old story of India. You could read Indian non-alignment that way as well if you wanted to, which is that use the differences amongst big powers to improve its own bargaining position. And how does it do that? Implicitly, India is saying, to China, the United States, even Russia to some extent, which is, if you pressurize India too much, we will defect to the other side completely. So don't push us too hard. If Chinese pressure on India is too much, the threat India holds out is that it will really sign up to a kind of alliance with the United States, which would not be in China's interest. If the Americans push us too hard or ignore us too much over something, where we flirt with the Chinese to remind the Americans not to take us for granted. Likewise, if the Russians get too close to Pakistan and to China, I think India suggests periodically to Moscow, in a nuanced kind of way, that India will get closer to Washington and Western powers. So India's, from a position of relative weakness, it's using this threat of defection to the opposing alliance system to generate some bargaining power. And it's worked relatively well for India. It doesn't always work. There were periods in the Cold War where India almost ended up with no friends and backers. So that's the risk of this strategy, is that if you're not quite in anyone's camp, then you may have no one helping you out at a critical moment. Never quite happened disastrously for India during the Cold War, but it's a risk of the strategy. But I think that's what India is playing, and I think that's what India will continue to do. It doesn't want to be taken for granted by any of the other three powers. So it will not opt completely for one camp or the other, short of some strategic catastrophe.
Let me move to a question on the border. Like there is saying that how long can Xi extend this standoff with India at Ladakh, and what are its implications on their relations? How do we see the future of India-China relations? Similarly, we have other question like what India and China should do to come out of this conflict deadlock, and will both countries, how can both the countries can cooperate in future? Similarly, with the growing tension between India and China's relations, how important have SCO and BRICS forum become? And another is how can the two Asian neighbors manage to reclaim glory of the Asian century?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess you're right to club them because they're kind of circling around what is the future of the relationship in various ways. So, I mean, just to take the border, for instance, I think that, it's always a bit difficult to make a great prognostication, but clearly they're in a tight spot, both of them, on the border. And there doesn't seem to be any great sense in which China is in a hurry to settle. Of course, China has been saying that for many, many years. We used to hold an India-China dialogue here in Singapore between two delegations on both sides of senior people. And it was very clear that while the Indian side wanted to move quicker to resolve the border in a final settlement, the Chinese view was to leave it to the next generation. Now, how seriously or sincere that was, or how much that was just a delay tactic, it was not very clear, but there's a fundamental difference there that India would like to, at the end of the day, find a solution sooner rather than later. Now we're back to that sooner versus later school, except that now it's on the two sides. India would like to settle it sooner. China is the view that there's no hurry. Maybe partly, as I said, because of the huge power disparity, the Chinese are in no hurry. They have the whip hand, they have the superior power position. So I think that's a great difficulty in dealing with the problem. I think it's been made worse by, in a sense, progress in capabilities. As military projection capabilities improved, as infrastructure first on the Chinese side in Tibet improved in the 1990s, early 2000s, and as then Indian road building in response improved over the last 10 years, both sides were able to push troops and equipment right up to the front lines into areas where they used to patrol, but just intermittent patrolling and not stay put. Excuse me. Now they tend to send them there more often and demand a more prolonged stay. And I think that's been an irritant. And so they're victims of their own growing capabilities and power projection capacities. And so these frictions on the border, it doesn't seem to me are going to go away anytime soon. Therefore, again, now, if you look at the border, I think there's every chance that it's not just Ladakh, but Arunachal, which is very problematic. Chinese claims there remain since 2006 that they own all of Arunachal Pradesh. It's not the old position of perhaps we can make a settlement along the McMahon line, give or take a little bit, or even that, if we could, if China could get Tawang, then perhaps, there would be a settlement. I mean, they've stuck to a position that all of Arunachal Pradesh, so-called South Tibet, is theirs. That makes it almost impossible in that sector to find a settlement. And so, and note also that in terms of military capabilities, their various regional military headquarters are much closer to Arunachal Pradesh than they are to Ladakh. So if they wanted to project power and really fight it out, they're far better able to do it in the Arunachal sector, the so-called, what the Indians call the eastern sector, than they are in Ladakh. So they're not, I don't think Beijing is in any position to, or any mind to be terribly helpful on the border issue for the time being. And as I said, India will find it very, very difficult after Galwan, and given its weaker position, to make any great concessions. Tawang is a big issue, and because of the monastery there and its significance for Tibetan Buddhism. And please note that we're in a transition period with Tibetan Buddhism, in the sense that the present Dalai Lama is getting older, and a day will come when there will be a new Dalai Lama, and the Chinese will certainly want their Dalai Lama. They made it absolutely clear. The Tibetans in exile and perhaps within Tibet and the diaspora here and there around the world will want to choose their own Dalai Lama and make it stick. Imagine New Delhi's position. It will have Beijing insisting that Delhi, in essence, recognize the Dalai Lama they've chosen. And there will be a very strong expectation in India, as well as globally, that India accept the Dalai Lama that would be chosen by the Tibetans outside of China and perhaps within China. So that would be a very tricky moment in India-China relations, and therefore on the safety of the border. So here is one other answer to the problem. It's not just that the border has some tricky issues because they have a difference over how soon they should settle. It's not just China's military capabilities and its claims over all of Arunachal Pradesh, but it's going back to the point I made at the beginning. The border issue is related to the Tibet issue. In fact, I sometimes say, if you want to think India-China relations, always think Tibet. Until Tibet is finally clearly resolved between the two, I find it hard to believe there will be a real settlement and stability in the borderlands. So, and we're coming to a point when the Tibetan issue is going to get more difficult, not easier, between the two, and for China's control over Tibet. So, I mean, an answer to the question of where is the future of the relationship, I don't think it's going to be an easy future. Whatever may be, geopolitically in terms of partnerships, maybe the, economic relations will improve, maybe the horrible perceptions of each other that they have through public diplomacy, cultural interchange, those kinds of differences can to some extent be abridged or reduced. But what are you going to do about the next 10 or 15 years and the issue of Tibetan Buddhism and its leadership? It could be a very tricky business. And if if India will be under enormous pressure on how to deal with this. And given distrust on Beijing's side over Tibet, they could very fundamentally misread Indian actions on Tibet in the future. And then we could have a real problem. So I just don't think that, on the partnerships issue, on the perceptions issue, even if the power gap is reduced, this issue of Tibet, I think, has to be really, it could be a very defining matter in the next 15 to 20 years. Yeah. I didn't address all the issues there, but I think that probably my take on the Tibet issue is probably where I would really come down on how difficult it's going to be to get them to make up.
So we have lots of questions on Indo-Pacific. Let me pick one or two more. Like, how far do you think that India can counter China in the Indo-Pacific region and emerge as a dominant player against China, and to lead the South Asia region in the context of current geopolitical scenario? And what is the Indian position on the South China Sea dispute, as China's increasing ability to decide and expand its role in the South China Sea has compelled India to start internationalizing disputes in the Indo-Pacific region to oppose China's threatening tactics in the South China Sea?
Well, I mean, on the first question of India's ability to project power into the Indo-Pacific region, which goes, all the way from the East Japan Sea, East China Sea, where there's the Chinese-Japanese conflict, to the South China Sea, through the Malacca Strait, into the Bay of Bengal, around the Indian Peninsula, and into the Arabian Sea and all of that. I mean, I think it varies, obviously. India can't project much naval power after the Malacca Strait. That's very clear. Indian naval chiefs have said so very openly. We don't have the submarines. We don't have the carrier force that would be very secure there. And we don't have an expeditionary force of any kind that could really hold its own there. Very difficult to supply a flotilla out there. And we don't have enough of a submarine force. We don't have nuclear-powered submarines that could stay underwater, for instance, for long periods of time, great distances from Indian naval bases. So it's a non-starter to say that India can project power into the South China Sea. The Americans know it, the Australians know it, the Chinese know it, the Japanese know it, which is why, in a sense, you have AUKUS, which is that the Anglo-American powers realize that India cannot play much of a role there. The Japanese have their own difficulties there because of their constitution and so forth. So in the buildup of Japanese military power, although the Japanese Navy is very capable, but long term, Australia's Navy might have to be the one that has to be really built up to play a role in the Western Pacific and also up to the South China Sea with nuclear-powered submarines. So I don't think India aspires to really fundamentally and has the capability to play any kind of very telling role in, beyond the Malacca Straits. Can it bottle up the Malacca Straits? By itself, I doubt it. And it would be a thankless task, because you have to remember that if you want to stop traffic in the Malacca Straits, you've got to stop all non-military shipping to make sure that stuff is not getting through to China. Now imagine stopping the shipping of countries from all over the world that are plying their ships through that area, including friendly countries. An enormous task for the Indian Navy, and not one that will necessarily get us great thanks. And by the way, I mean, the Chinese have alternative routes. They're longer routes, and they're not as secure in terms of maritime traffic because of the depth of the ocean and things like that. But it can be done. And by the way, the Chinese could it could be a fight there at the Malacca Strait. So we could only do it in partnership with the Australians, the Japanese, the Americans. And this idea that India could stop the Malacca Straits is total nonsense to my mind, including those people who say, oh, if there was a fight with the Chinese on the border, then India could respond by blocking the Malacca Straits. I mean, I think that's laughable, frankly. It's just a non-starter. In the Bay of Bengal, of course, India's strengths come into play much more. If the Chinese Navy comes into the Bay of Bengal, then the shoe is on the other foot. Now the Chinese are extended. Indian capabilities closer to shore are much more telling, both naval and air, and the Chinese will be in trouble. And the further the Chinese get into the Western Indian Ocean up to the Arabian Sea, the more they're vulnerable to the Indian Navy. And as I said earlier, I mean, good luck to the Chinese if they want to position assets in Gwadar and Djibouti. I think they would be extremely vulnerable to India. And if India partners Western navies, then even more so. So it's a losing proposition for the Chinese at the moment there. So at the moment, I'm not greatly concerned about the naval issue in the Bay of Bengal, the Indian Ocean, for the Indian Navy. That's where India can contribute and take on a certain amount of patrolling and reconnaissance and shadowing the Chinese Navy and so on. I think that's plausible. So I think India's larger role in the Indo-Pacific is really as a kind of diplomatic sort of partner of the other three powers, Japan, Australia, the United States, standing for free traffic, you know, the UNCLOS regime, et cetera, et cetera. India showing the flag there occasionally and being a kind of diplomatic political presence, but not a great deal more, you know. Yeah, India has also stepped away from a certain kind of economic engagement. It pulled out of the RCEP. It's not a player in the CPTPP, which Japan has pushed with Singapore and other Southeast Asian countries and Australia and New Zealand, which China now is has put a membership in for. India has a certain amount of bilateral defense cooperation in the region, but these are mostly training, selling some equipment, some economic agreements, but it does some military maintenance work for countries that have old Soviet equipment or Russian equipment, because we know how to maintain those platforms, ships and MiG aircraft and so on and so forth. But it is not an enormous military player in this region, although the region likes us to show our flag here. So I think, you know, it's useful for India to be part of this broader kind of diplomatic military coalition, but a real material Indian role in the Indo-Pacific is quite limited, frankly. And therefore, it makes a lot of sense for India to be fairly modest and ambivalent about its commitment to it, you know. Not sure what else I want to say about this, which was located in your question. On the leadership of South Asia, you know, I mean, I think we can see in the last few months that the problems in Sri Lanka have dramatized, you know, the fact that obviously the Rajapakshas in Sri Lanka facing a real economic challenge. Bangladesh seems to be doing fairly, you know, making steady economic progress. In fact, in some respects, better than India, particularly in human development and posting really rather good rates of economic growth. Nepal has been quite dynamic in the last few years, although it's had its own political, you know, kind of moments of change and so forth. But so I think, you know, India recognizing its own preoccupations with internal politics, its ups and downs somewhat with its economy, and the growing power of China. I mean, I think it's very clear that over the last 20 years, India has stopped trying to insist that South Asia is India's backyard or sphere of influence or whatever you want to call it. I mean, Pakistan was in any case not really part of that, obviously, but there was a kind of Indian expectation or view that India could be, you know, could expect certain things from its neighbors because of India's size, relative size. I think India's had to get used to the idea that China is just too big and powerful. And, you know, there's a kind of diplomatic issue there as well, which is that India reserves the right, of course, to cultivate all the countries on China's periphery in Southeast Asia, in Northeast Asia. So if that's the case, then in what way can Delhi insist that China not equally engage Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, you know, Afghanistan and all of that? I mean, it's just not on. And I think, you know, if India over the last 15, 20 years has increasingly acknowledged that and has publicly said, of course, we cannot keep China out of South Asia. It's just not on. I think that's just a recognition of reality and a recognition of the fact that, India reserves the right to engage on China's periphery, and that's perfectly legitimate. There's nothing India can do then to keep China out of this region, except for, being a good citizen to its neighbors and trying to engage them and do what it can in partnership with them. Not to give up Indian interests in the region. India has legitimate interests with its neighbors, but also it simply cannot, exercise hegemony and tell its neighbors what to do vis-a-vis China. So I think India is in a good place that way. It's come around to a very sensible position in respect of that. Although from time to time, Delhi does, seemingly make mistakes that way. But Mr. Modi is due in Nepal any day, I think, and he's coming, I think, with an altered view of how to deal with neighboring countries. Going back 5 or 6 years, perhaps he had a somewhat different view, and today I think he has a more realistic view.
Thank you, sir. We still have around 25 to 30 questions, but we're running out of time. Let me just take last 2 questions.
Yep.
Have India gone too far in its relationship with US to have good relation with China? And second is it possible for India and China to have cooperative partnership rather than confrontational?
Well, I'm not sure what going too far with the US means. I mean, we have a lot of differences with the Americans even now. Over Ukraine, over Pakistan, over Afghanistan, over visas for Indian professionals, over trade issues, over India's role in the Indo-Pacific, which I think the Americans are altogether happy with. Our ambivalence is there. So there are a number of issues there over climate change. And one could take off other points, I think, over things like humanitarian intervention and so on. So certainly there's a lot still to be adjusted with the Americans, no question about that. So I wouldn't say we've gone too far. Yes, buying more arms from the Americans, but that's still eclipsed by what it is sourcing from the Russians. It has not signed up for an alliance with the United States altogether. And it certainly has no expectation that the United States will come to, fundamental military aid if there was to be, again, conflict with China. American troops will not land in the borderlands to help India fight. It might help out in other ways, as it did during the Galwan conflict, sharing information and intelligence and so on, and some equipment, but that's very different. So I wouldn't say that India's gone too far. I think there are commentators in India who would say India should go much further, but India's kept a certain distance. And there are other difficulties. It's very clear that the increasing American criticism, sometimes official, sometimes in the press, sometimes from think tanks about India's human rights, its backsliding on democracy, etc. India is not comfortable with this. And there's been a very sharp tone from Delhi, from Jaishankar and so on, in retort to these kinds of criticisms. So India's, in that sense, more comfortable with the point of view of China and Russia on these matters than it is with the Americans and the Western Europeans. So no, I think there are a lot of points of difference with the United States, and they do get in the way of the relationship being much closer. And on can China and India do more business? I mean, I think, what would be a fundamental resolution? As I've said, I'm not very optimistic about the future because of Tibet and the 4 Ps, but one can see that, there's certain things they can still probably try and do. On perceptions, I mean, there are ways in which the government could encourage, the media and so on to tone down some of the kind of bad mouthing of each other. So that would be quite important. I mean, governments can't control everything, but they can start to signal the return of public diplomacy, of cultural diplomacy, and so on. But right now, that's a non-starter because India will not normalize until China begins to do something about what happened after Galwan. So I think there's a problem there. And then, on the border, as I say, I mean, there's nothing happening there. They can't even get back to pre-Galwan, what to talk of negotiations on the border. Although I suspect in private, there are some discussions going on how to get back to a more collaborative relationship. Note that the CBMs, the confidence building measures that were negotiated over the years since the early 1990s, I mean, we can say that they failed because Galwan happened, but it's a glass half full. I mean, that scrap in Galwan was still very contained. I mean, here are two massive militaries, and I mean, any lives lost are sad, but India only lost 20 lives, and the Chinese claim only 4. So, I mean, for two militaries, which are two the biggest in the world, it wasn't a war, it wasn't an extended fight, no shots were fired as far as we know, there are no artillery duels. So in a sense, the CBMs held. Stability was maintained. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. There have been calls, particularly in India, to, get rid of the CBMs, they're all failures. And no, maybe not. They may have prevented escalation on the border in that scrap and in the other episodes in the preceding years. So, I mean, I would say still affirm those. That's one area still to informally talk to the Chinese about, and between China and India, to continue a dialogue there. And I suspect that's going on because neither wants a real flare-up. In terms of third P, these partnerships, I mean, have shown how I think they haven't gone to extremes, even though they're not on the same side, to exaggerate their differences over the Indo-Pacific, for instance, and now over Ukraine. They've held to a kind of more moderate position, both of them. So I think they should stick to that. That's at least a holding operation there. And last on the power, I think here it's really up to India. India has to, by its own efforts, close that gap. And if it doesn't do so, then it's very hard to see how the two can look at each other as equals and come to a position of, sort of making concessions to each other and finding ways to really engage. At the moment, and this is really India. India has to get its economic act together above all, and also to start producing its own arms. So I think the move to Atmanirbhar and all that that Modi is talking about, it's not easy, and there's been a lot of kind of tom-tomming in India. What a fantastic, really nothing much is moving at the moment, but and obviously it can't be an overnight change, but that fundamental change has to occur in India. I mean, not to close India economically or technologically, that's impossible, but to really galvanize Indian industry, manufacturing, technology, education. See, what lies behind India's laggardliness? Ultimately, its modes of governance, its efficiencies in administration, its changes in legal structures, its improvements in health and education. I mean, the gaps there with China are so enormous. 40% of Indians are stunted. That's 600 million people. Stunting means that malnutrition and ill health have impaired the cognitive abilities of people. 600 million Indians, their cognitive abilities have been affected by, either the nutrition of the mother during pregnancy or the first 1,000 days of their childhood where they were sick or denied proper food and nutrition. I mean, that is a weight of people that will have to be carried because they may not be able to function in a modern technological society. So I mean, these are kinds of very fundamental things that India has to solve. Its internal instabilities, the rising tide of, communalism. I describe at the end of the book that India almost needs a civilizational change. And I don't mean civilizational about, going back to some Ram Raj or some golden era that probably never existed. It's not that. It's not some Hindutva golden age I'm talking about, but a fundamental solving of social, economic, administrative, legal, political problems. I mean, look at, for instance, and I'll just finish with this one thought before I start to take you over your time limit, but there's one Indian MP for something like 2.5 million people on average in a constituency. In Sri Lanka, it's one MP to about 100,000 people. In Britain, it's the same. How can one MP represent 2.5 million people? I mean, you just think about political capacity in a country. When you look at the law and order situation, number of policemen per million population in India. I mean, you could have all the laws and rules you want, but if your inability to enforce your own rules and laws, I mean, not to turn India into a police state, but out of 75 countries that were surveyed 10 years ago or 8 years ago in terms of police capacity to population, India was 73 out of 75 countries, have the lowest level of number dealt with by the Indian legal system. These are fundamental sinews of administration and how can you run a modern economy in these kinds of circumstances. So a lot of what India has to do to deal with China, in a sense, comes from its own internal kind of strengthening.
Professor Kanti Bajpai, thank you so much for the interesting discussion. We really learned a lot and we're really grateful for your time. I'm sure our audience immensely benefited from it. I, on behalf of NICE and all our audience, would like to thank you for your kind presence and valuable time. We hope to have you in Kathmandu, maybe in real, in days to come.
I hope so.
We'd also like to thank all our audience for their wonderful questions. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day.